The seat in 3B, the sun spilled softly through the oval window, painting streaks of gold across the smooth leather seat of 3B. In that seat sat Amaya Carter, a 16-year-old black girl with big, thoughtful eyes and a worn-out green backpack tucked carefully under her legs. It wasn't just a bag. It was her companion through years of scholarship exams, long nights of studying, and moments when the world seemed far too heavy for a child to carry. This was her first flight alone. Her godmother, Dr. Naomi Brooks, had bought her the first-class ticket as a gift after she won top honors in a summer science program. For Amaya, this ticket wasn't just paper with a barcode. It was proof. Proof that she belonged in spaces people didn't expect her to enter. Proof that hard work and brilliance could open doors others tried to keep closed. Her fingers rested lightly on a book in her lap, but her eyes wandered to the clouds outside. She let herself smile. It was a quiet smile, the kind that said, "I made it here, and I earned it." But the silence of that moment didn't last. The sharp echo of high heels cut through the cabin. Passengers lifted their heads as a tall woman in a crisp navy uniform walked confidently down the aisle. Her name tag read Sandra Whitmore, head flight attendant. Her smile, painted carefully in red, flickered as her eyes landed on Amaya. In an instant, her expression shifted from professional charm to cold suspicion. Sandra stopped directly at seat 3B. She didn't greet Amaya. She didn't even check the boarding list in her hand. Instead, in a voice loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, she snapped, "You're in the wrong seat." Not a question, a command. Amaya looked up, startled, but calm. "This is my seat, 3B. She replied softly, holding her boarding pass. Sandra crossed her arms, tilting her head as if the very sight of Amaya in that leet. Her chair was offensive. "This is first class, young lady," she said, pressing hard on the last two words. Her tone dripped with something more than authority. It carried judgment. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. A man in a tailored suit peered over his glasses. A woman with pearl earrings pursed her lips. Some looked curious, others indifferent, but not one spoke up. Amaya swallowed. Her heart raced, but her voice didn't break. She pulled the boarding pass from her hoodie pocket and offered it. The bold black letters were impossible to deny. Seat 3B, first class. Sandra barely glanced at it. Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening in a thin line. "No," she said sharply. "Take your things and move to economy. Now." The words sliced the air like a blade. The cabin grew still. Not a whisper, not a cough. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Amaya's hands tightened on her backpack straps. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to demand an explanation, but inside she knew. It wasn't the ticket, it wasn't the seat, it was her hoodie, her sneakers, her skin. Her chest ached, but she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She lifted her chin, her voice steady beyond her years. "This is my seat," she repeated quietly. Sandra's eyes hardened. She waved toward the back of the plane. "Don't argue, you're holding up boarding." And just like that, the judgment was passed. No evidence needed, no second thought, just the assumption that Amaya Carter did not belong in 3B. The silence of the cabin pressed on her like 1,000 eyes. She felt each stare, curious, disapproving, dismissive. Yet not one person rose to defend her. Amaya gripped her phone under the table tray. Her thumb hovered over the screen. One message, just one message could change everything. She took a breath, her voice silent, but her heart resolute. If no one would stand for her, she would stand for herself. And with that, Amaya pressed send. Silence in the cabin. The engines hummed softly in the distance, a low vibration under Amaya's seat. But inside the cabin, the sound that dominated was silence. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that made the air feel heavy, the kind that turned curious glances into sharp needles piercing her skin. Sandra Whitmore stood tall, arms folded like a gatekeeper guarding the doors of privilege. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a stern mask that dared Amaya to resist. "Young lady, don't make me repeat myself. You're in the wrong section. Get up and move. Amaya's fingers tightened on her phone hidden under her tray table. The message was already sent. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a quiet courage that refused to bow. She thought of her godmother, Dr. Naomi Brooks, who had looked into her eyes just yesterday and said, "Never lower your head to those who don't respect you. If they can't see your worth, let the truth reveal it for you." Still seated, Amaya raised her chin. "My ticket says 3B. This is where I belong." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled around the strap of her backpack. Sandra's lips curled into a thin smile, not of kindness but of triumph. "Don't argue with me. You'll disturb other passengers." She gestured toward the back, her hands slicing the air as if Amaya were nothing but baggage to be moved. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One man cleared his throat as if he might say something, then quickly looked away. Another woman whispered to her husband, her eyes flicking between Sandra and Amaya. But no one spoke up. No one dared challenge the uniform and authority Sandra wore like armor. Amaya's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to ask the question burning inside, "Would you treat me this way if I didn't look like this?" But she stayed calm. She had learned the hard way that sometimes silence was stronger than shouting. Sandra leaned closer, lowering her voice but making sure others could still hear. "Listen, sweetheart. First, the class is not for everyone. You'll be more comfortable in economy." The words stung more than the command, "not for everyone." They echoed in Amaya's ears like a cruel chorus. She thought of the nights she stayed up studying, of the exams she had aced, of the scholarships she had earned. She thought of her godmother, proud tears shining in her eyes as she handed Amaya the ticket. And now, all of that, dismissed with a single sentence. Amaya unclipped her seatbelt slowly. She rose, clutching her backpack to her chest like a shield. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She walked toward the back of the plane, her steps quiet but heavy with the weight of injustice. Sandra watched her go, smugness flickering across her face. She had solved the problem. The gate was protected. Order restored. But Amaya knew something Sandra didn't. As she slid into the last row of economy, her phone buzzed once. Just a single vibration. She looked down. The reply had come. 3 words lit up her screen. "We're on it." Amaya's heart steadied. The ache in her chest eased. She leaned back, clutching her backpack, and whispered to herself, "You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the truth speaks louder in silence." Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, whispers began to ripple. A young woman frowned, murmuring to her husband, "She had a ticket, didn't she?" Another man shook his head but said nothing, choosing instead to bury his nose in the newspaper. Sandra straightened her jacket, smoothing the front with satisfaction. She turned to greet another passenger, her smile warm and polished again, as if the incident had never happened. To her, Amaya was erased, dismissed into the shadows of economy where she belonged. But Sandra had no idea that the shadows were about to stretch into light. The plane doors closed with a heavy thud. The engines roared louder, ready to push the fleet skyward. Yet beneath that sound, beneath the false calm of polite silence, something else had already been set into motion. Something that would stop the plane before it ever left the ground. Amaya sat quietly, her phone hidden in her lap. Her message had traveled farther than Sandra could imagine, and now the reply was here. The storm was coming. The captain's call, the seatbelt light flickered overhead, and the engines roared to life, their vibrations rumbling through the cabin floor. Passengers settled in with magazines, headphones, and casual chatter. To anyone watching, it looked like just another routine takeoff. But Amaya sat in the last row of economy, her phone hidden in her palm, her pulse steady. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. Then it happened. The engines quieted suddenly, dropping from a roar to a faint hum. Confused glances darted around the cabin. A man lowered his newspaper, frowning. A child asked her mother why the plane had stopped. Even Sandra Whitmore stiffened, her polished smile faltering. A crackle came over the intercom, followed by the steady voice of the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to pause departure for a moment. Please remain seated." The murmurs began. People looked at their watches. Delays were normal, but this felt different. The engines had powered down completely, and the cabin grew tense with the weight of anticipation. Sandra clicked across the aisle, her heels sharp against the floor. She whispered to a junior attendant, her eyes darting toward the economy section. She looked unsettled, but quickly masked it with a forced smile for a nearby passenger. Minutes passed, heavy and slow. Then the cabin doors hissed open again. The sound of firm boots echoed through the aisle. 2 uniformed federal officers stepped onto the plane, followed by a third carrying a tablet. Their presence silenced everything. The air turned electric. Passengers froze. Some stiffened with nervousness. Others craned their necks to see. Sandra's eyes widened, but she quickly smoothed her expression, plastering on professionalism. "Officers," she said with a polite smile, "is there a problem?" The tallest officer ignored her, his gaze sweeping the cabin with quiet authority. The third officer tapped on the tablet, scrolling through data. Then the tall one spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to verify the presence of one passenger." He paused, scanning the seats. "Where is Ms. Amaya Carter?" The words dropped like stones into a still pond. The ripples of shock spread instantly. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Eyes darted toward the back of the plane. Sandra blinked rapidly, her lips parting in disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "Did you say Carter?" The officer nodded. "Ms. Amaya Carter, 16 years old. She's on this flight." All at once, every gaze shifted to the last row of economy, where Amaya sat quietly with her backpack on her lap. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She lifted her head, her eyes calm, almost defiant. "Yes," she said softly, her voice carrying farther than she expected. "I'm Amaya." The officers exchanged a look. The one with the tablet checked her name against the manifest. "Confirmed," he said. Sandra's face drained of color. She forced a laugh, sharp and uneasy. "Oh, well, yes, of course she's here. I already handled the situation. She accidentally sat in first class." The tall officer cut her off with a raised hand. "That's not your concern. We need to speak with her immediately." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned closer, their curiosity burning hotter than before. A man muttered, "What's going on?" While a woman whispered, "Why would federal agents be here for a teenager?" Sandra's throat tightened. She turned to Amaya, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "See, dear? You caused quite a fuss. You should have just stayed quiet." But Amaya didn't look at her. She stood slowly, clutching her backpack, her face calm as stone. The officers motioned for her to follow, but not toward the exit. Instead, they guided her down the aisle. Passengers' whispers grew louder. Someone asked if she was in trouble. Another speculated she must be important. And then, as Amaya reached the first-class cabin, the captain himself stepped out from the cockpit. His uniform gleamed, his expression firm, but when his eyes landed on Amaya, his posture softened. He gave a respectful nod. "Ms. Carter," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin, "we've been instructed to halt the flight until your seating situation is corrected." A stunned silence followed. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, every passenger realized the truth. The girl they had watched being humiliated was the reason their plane wasn't moving. Sandra's knees wobbled, her carefully built authority crumbled in an instant. And for the first time since the boarding began, Amaya allowed herself a small smile. The truth unfolds. The cabin of the plane was silent, but not calm. It was the silence of disbelief, of hundreds of thoughts racing, yet no one daring to speak first. All eyes were fixed on the slim black teenager standing near the captain, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Sandra Whitmore, still frozen in place, blinked rapidly, her cheeks flushing crimson beneath her carefully applied makeup. Just moments ago, she had barked orders, demanded Amaya leave, and dismissed her boarding pass without a glance. Now, with the captain himself addressing the girl with respect, Sandra's mask of authority began to crack. Ms. Carter, the captain said, his tone formal but softened by something else. Recognition. You'll need to return to your assigned seat. Until that happens, this aircraft is grounded. The words landed like thunder. Grounded. An entire flight filled with executives, families, and travelers on tight schedules, halted because of one teenager who had been denied her rightful place. Murmurs spread instantly, too, through the rows. Did he just say grounded? One man whispered. For her? Another replied, disbelief thick in his voice. A woman clutching her pearls shook her head. What could she possibly mean to this airline? Sandra forced a nervous laugh, trying to regain her footing. She stepped forward quickly. Captain, with all respect, this young lady must have made a mistake. She was clearly confused about her seat. The tall federal officer raised a hand sharply, silencing her. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made every passenger lean in. We've reviewed the passenger manifest. There was no mistake. Amaya Carter purchased a first-class ticket, seat 3B, and she has every right to sit there. The officer with the tablet added firmly, her name was flagged for additional clearance, which is why we were contacted. She is not only a passenger, but she is also registered under the Federal Youth Aviation Program. That gives her direct oversight privileges. Gasps, murmurs. The cabin was no longer silent, it buzzed with shock. Sandra's face went pale. Oh, oversight privileges? She stammered. The officer's gaze was unyielding. Correct. Ms. Carter's godmother, Dr. Naomi Brooks, is part of the Federal Aviation Board. This passenger is under her guardianship and protection. When Ms. Carter reported a discriminatory action during boarding, it was escalated instantly. The order to halt this plane came from headquarters. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some covered their mouths. Others muttered words of shame for not speaking up when Sandra first humiliated her. A man whispered to his wife, "She wasn't just some kid. She was the reason the flight stopped." Sandra tried to speak again, but her voice faltered. I didn't know. I thought..." Amaya's voice cut through the cabin, calm and steady, but with quiet steel beneath it. "You didn't think. You judged." Her eyes held Sandra's for a long moment, not with cruelty, but with a piercing truth that made the older woman flinch. The captain turned, addressing the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We cannot depart until Ms. Carter is seated in her rightful place." Every eye followed as Amaya walked slowly back toward the front of the cabin. The same aisle that had once felt like a walk of shame was now transformed into a path of vindication. Passengers who had looked away earlier now lowered their eyes, ashamed of their silence. One woman whispered a soft apology as Amaya passed. Another man cleared his throat, but his words never came. Amaya reached 3B. The leather seat that had been denied her now stood waiting, empty, like justice itself. She set her backpack down carefully, slid into the chair, and folded her hands in her lap. The captain gave a small nod of respect before returning to the cockpit. The federal officers remained in first class, watching closely. Sandra, standing at the side, looked like a statue about to crumble. For the first time since the ordeal began, Amaya exhaled deeply. She wasn't just reclaiming a seat. She was reclaiming dignity stolen from her in front of dozens of silent witnesses. Justice on the runway. The engines rumbled back to life, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed forever. The hum of machines could not cover the whispers that swept through the passengers like wildfire. Some spoke in hushed tones, others shook their heads, but all of them now knew the truth. The girl they had seen humiliated was the very reason they were still on the ground. Amaya sat in 3B, her posture calm, her hands folded neatly over her backpack. To anyone watching, she looked like any quiet teenager on her first flight, but the air around her was charged, as though the weight of justice itself now rested on her shoulders. Sandra, meanwhile, stood rigid near the galley, her face pale, her throat dry. Her authority, once so sharp and commanding, had crumbled into something fragile. She smoothed her uniform again and again, but no gesture could hide the trembling in her hands. Passengers began to murmur louder now, no longer hiding their disapproval. "I saw her show the ticket," one man said angrily. "The attendant didn't even check." "She judged her the second she looked at her," another woman whispered. "I should have spoken up." "I thought about it too," a younger passenger admitted, his voice tinged with guilt. But I stayed quiet. We all stayed quiet. The shame spread like smoke, filling every corner of first class. One of the federal officers stepped forward, his tone clipped but firm. "Captain, the report has been logged. Until we finish our inquiry, this aircraft cannot take off." Sandra gasped, panic flashing in her eyes. "Inquiry?" The officer fixed her with a piercing stare. "Yes, ma'am. We have to investigate why a valid first-class passenger was forcibly moved to economy despite presenting proper documentation, and why the crew member responsible failed to verify the manifest." Passengers straightened in their seats, eyes widening. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was official. This was accountability. Sandra tried to defend herself, her words tumbling out fast and desperate. "I was only trying to maintain order." She looked confused. "I thought she didn't belong there." Her voice broke off under the officer's gaze. The silence that followed was louder than any argument she could make. Amaya finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. "You didn't think I didn't belong. You decided it, without even looking at my ticket." Her words weren't shouted, but they landed with the weight of truth, undeniable and sharp. The officer nodded gravely. Ms. Carter's message triggered a direct alert to the Aviation Oversight Board. Her godmother authorized her with clearance in case of emergency. That's why we're here. Sandra staggered back, a step, her hand gripping the counter for support. "Her godmother?" "Yes," the officer said firmly. "Dr. Naomi Brooks. You may have heard of her." Gasps echoed across the cabin. Of course they had heard of her. Dr. Brooks was a federal aviation director, known for pushing reforms to ensure fairness and equality in air travel. To many, she was a respected authority. To Sandra, the name landed like a hammer blow. Whispers rose again, sharper this time. "She's connected to the board? Her godmother's that Dr. Brooks? No wonder the flight's grounded." Sandra's face burned red. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words. Her authority had been stripped away, her excuses exposed. The officer motioned to two colleagues. "Ma'am, you'll need to step off this flight for questioning." The cabin gasped as Sandra was gently but firmly escorted down the aisle. Her polished heels clicked against the floor, but this time they sounded hollow. She kept her head down, unable to meet the eyes of the passengers who now watched her with cold judgment. For the first time since the incident began, the balance of power shifted entirely. Amaya sat in her seat, not triumphant, but calm, a quiet dignity radiating from her as she stared out the window at the endless runway. A man in the row ahead turned slightly, his voice low but sincere. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her. "I should have said something." A woman across the aisle added, "So should I. You didn't deserve that." Amaya nodded softly. She didn't need their apologies, but she accepted them. Not for herself, but because she hoped maybe, just maybe, they would remember this moment the next time silence tempted them. The captain returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Once this matter is resolved, we will resume preparations for takeoff." But everyone knew this flight would not be remembered for delays or schedules. It would be remembered for the moment prejudice was stopped in its tracks by a single text from a girl who refused to bow. Respect. Finally. The cabin door shut once more, but this time it wasn't the start of a routine flight. It was the end of an ordeal. Sandra Whitmore was gone, escorted off the plane by officers who spoke in clipped voices and carried authority that even she could not challenge. Her absence left behind a quiet void, a silence that seemed both heavy and cleansing. The passengers shifted in their seats, still murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others stared out the window, ashamed of their own silence earlier. The air buzzed with one shared realization. They had all been present when injustice unfolded before their eyes, and most of them had done nothing. Amaya Carter sat back in seat 3B, her backpack carefully on her lap, the hum of the engines now a soothing rhythm in her ears. The leather chair felt the same as it had at the beginning, but everything else was different. This was no longer just a seat, it was a symbol of her place, her worth, her undeniable right to exist in spaces people thought she didn't belong. The captain himself came down the aisle, his presence commanding yet respectful. He stopped by her row, lowering his voice so others could hear but still giving her privacy. "Ms. Carter," he said, "on behalf of the crew, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. This cabin, this flight belongs to every passenger who earns their ticket, and you more than earned yours." He leaned down slightly, lifting her backpack with care and placed it gently into the overhead compartment. It was a small gesture, but the cabin noticed. The most senior officer on the plane had carried her bag, something no passenger had seen him do before. Amaya nodded softly. "Thank you, Captain." Her voice was calm, but her words carried a weight that hung in the air long after she spoke. From across the aisle, a woman, final, lie broke the silence. "You shouldn't have gone through that, dear." Her tone was gentle, regretful. "I should have spoken up sooner." Another man in a suit leaned forward. "So should all of us. We just sat here." His voice cracked slightly with guilt. Amaya turned her gaze toward them, her eyes steady, not accusing but honest. "Silence lets things like this happen," she said softly. "If you see something wrong, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Speak up." The words, simple yet piercing, washed through the cabin. Some lowered their heads, others nodded slowly. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of her message. The federal officer who remained on board gave her a slight nod of respect, as though to say, "Well said." Moments later, the captain returned to the cockpit, and the engines roared to full power again. This time, the sound didn't feel like background noise. It felt like a declaration, a reset, a new beginning for everyone on board. As the plane lifted off the runway and the earth fell away beneath them, Amaya looked out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, painted in shades of gold and white. For the first time that day, she let herself exhale fully. She had faced humiliation, silence, and prejudice. But she had not bent. And when she stepped off that plane, she knew someone important would be waiting. At the arrival gate stood Dr. Naomi Brooks, her godmother, dignified and strong, her eyes brimming with pride the moment they met Amaya's. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The embrace they shared said everything. "You held your head high," Dr. Brooks whispered into her ear. "That's all I ever wanted for you, to never let anyone decide your worth." Amaya smiled, her heart swelling. She had learned something on that flight, not just about courage, but about silence, dignity, and the cost of prejudice. As she walked away from the terminal with her godmother's arm wrapped protectively around her, she carried more than a backpack. She carried a lesson the entire cabin would remember. Never judge a person by their skin, their clothes, or their age. Seats are earned by effort, not appearance. And silence in the face of injustice is its own form of cruelty. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet strength of a girl in seat 3B.